It's really a pleasure to be here and to talk to you and to give you a bit of an overview of some work that we've been doing. And there's kind of the main part of the talk is looking at how we combine machine learning with what I usually do, which is formal methods and quite mechanistic models. And then just at the end, I'll talk about some of the challenges that we're starting to look at, particularly with respect to large language models. So to give you a quick overview, first of all, I'm going to explain what I mean by performance modelling, because I'm aware that it's quite a small area that not many people come across. Even people do whole degrees in computer science and never come across the term or the methods that we use as motivation for the kinds of models that I'm interested in. And then, as I say, the bulk of the talk is two different techniques that we're using, combining these formal methods with different forms of machine learning. And I'll go through each of those, and then just at the end, a little bit on performance of LLMs. So when we talk about performance modelling, we're really very focused on the resources within a system. So this might be all sorts of different things that you obviously think of resources. So when we go to the post office, the number of counters open are the resources available to us. They are the servers. In a transport system, it might be a segment of road or a segment of track that will then limit how much traffic you can get within the system. In a classic performance setting, this would be elements of the computing system, so it might be the disk or it might be bandwidth in a network. And more recently, we've looked a lot at using these techniques within biological systems where the resource might be, for example, proteins in a cell signaling pathway or genes that you need to transcribe. So if a resource is available just when you need it, then you just proceed and you're barely aware of it. But quite often the demand for resource in systems is more than there is resource available. And this will lead to additional delays, often captured as kind of queues as the abstraction, that you have some contention for resource that will then limit how much work the system can do in a very abstract sense. So when we seek to understand systems, particularly from this resource perspective, is what we call performance modelling. Performance modelers try to construct models so that we can look at the dynamic behaviour, so that we can support reasonable use of resource. And reasonable can include all sorts of different perspectives. You may want to make sure that it's fair, that you don't have starvation problems, that people can't access the resource, that it's equitable in some sense, that it's affordable, that the costing is appropriately set, or sustainable in that you're not being profligate with resource and over-provisioning systems. So the challenge is that often system users and system operators want different things. So the customers or users of a system will want to improve their experience of the system. So this will be minimizing delays. So ideally, whenever they want a resource, it's available to them, in which case their response time, the time that they spend interacting with the system, will be the shortest possible. It will just be the time it needs to do their work, and they won't suffer any of this contention. They want to get as much work done as possible, which we often term in terms of throughput. So the number of units of work done per unit time is as high as possible, and we don't want any wasted effort. So sometimes in systems we may have blocking probability, and so jobs get dropped halfway through, and that wastes a lot. So we want blocking probability to be as low as possible. But if we look at it from the system manager or operator's point of view, we need to make sure that the resources that we have, which are often costly in some sense, are used to the best overall use. So not for the individual's point of view, but from a system point of view. So we want to know that the proportion of time, the utilisation of a resource is reasonably high. Conversely, that usually equates to we want the idle time to be as small as possible. And we want to not have so much congestion that we strain the system so that we generate failures. And so a lot of performance modelling is about trying to balance these two different points of view about resources in the system and develop a sort of sweet spot where both are tolerable. So classically, performance modelling has been done for over a century now. It was introduced by Erlang, looking at telephone exchange networks back in the early 20th century. And it was often based on this queuing abstraction. So the idea that requests arrive to the system where they're translated into jobs, and then when they're satisfied, they leave the system. And while the job is being processed, it holds the resource and then releases it when it's finished. And this is largely been in the 20th century done in terms of queuing networks, and queuing networks have this kind of representation as it's not a formal diagram, but it just captures these key things where in queuing theory, we worry about the pattern of arrivals, we worry about the size of the buffer, we look at the way that the server works, what distribution of service it might give, and we look at the departures from the queue. So, for example, the simplest queue would be that we have exponential arrivals, we have a buffer without constraint, and we have a server that does exponential service, and things are taken into service on first come, first served basis. But there are many other possibilities allowed as well. And then often we're not looking at a single system, we're looking at jobs that pass through a system. So if we think about work within a computer, we may access the CPU, we might access the GPU, we look at disk, and our jobs will circulate between these subsystems or individual resources in the system, and so we can look at each of those being a queue. So each generates requests and responses at its own level, and then we get queuing networks. And this worked extremely well. When we make those exponential assumptions, as we often do because it makes it much more tractable, then we get a continuous time Markov chain. And this can be solved either analytically or numerically, and there are very straightforward ways to derive those performance measures that I mentioned, like throughput, utilization, and response time. So for much of the 20th century, this worked extremely well, until we kind of came to the late 20th century when things became much more interconnected. So you think of it as almost broken by the internet, because this then started to break many assumptions that we see in standard queuing theory. So in standard queuing theory, we have that very sequential view that a job flows between different subsystems, and this may not be the case. It's perfectly normal for us to perhaps be using multiple resources at once across the system. Jobs may spawn other jobs and then be merged together, but in queuing theory it's not straightforward, in classic queuing theory at least, for jobs to be merged or to split. Patterns of arrival and service are made on an assumption of independence, and that's often not the case, and customers cannot change their behaviour dependent on the state of the system. So all of this meant that we needed new ways of representing these systems. The paradigm that we'd used in terms of queuing abstraction became not adequate for the kinds of systems we were modelling. So we moved on to using what are now called quantitative formal methods or quantitative formal modelling techniques, where we instead focus on the states of the system and the transitions between them. Now, we don't want to do this at the state space level, because often we're talking about continuous time Markov chains with millions of states, but we have a number of different formal languages that then are given semantics in terms of the CTMC. So you can think of this of you have a language, and instead of compiling it like a computer program into binary representation, we compile it into some mathematical representation. So examples of these formal methods are stochastic Petri nets, stochastic process algebras, which is where I've done much of my work, and chemical reaction networks. So it just depends on the type of system that you're modelling, what's the most natural way of describing them. But all of these different formal techniques really allow a lot of concurrency, which is what we were kind of lacking in the queuing abstraction. So depending on these models, what we do is we use the semantics, as I said, to derive a formal model, usually in terms of a CTMC. And the global states will be a configuration of local states in the different components. So we use this compositionality to help us build really large models, focusing on the individual parts that build up the system. When the size of the system is not too large, and our state-of-the-art tools, too large is something between 1 million and 10 million states, then we would look at a numerical solution and use linear algebra, essentially, and various techniques to derive the steady-state probability distribution or the transient probability distribution to tell us the likelihood of being in different states, and from those we can get those performance measures. And then when the CTMC is large, we instead use a stochastic simulation. So each run of the simulation generates a single trajectory through the state space, and we can then observe these measures that we're interested in, but we will need to make many runs in order to get the average behaviour that we're interested in. So this is just a very simple example of a state space so that I can talk about the idea of model checking, which I'm coming on to now. Obviously, this is based on a queue with some kind of shared service, but generally speaking, we're talking about much more complex state spaces. So we talk about model checking, and what we mean by model checking is actually checking the behavior of the model against a logical formula. So it's not actually checking the model to make sure it's correct, it's checking whether this model is adequate to capture the behavior expressed in a logical formula. So, for example, we might want to express the property of within 10 time units, we reach a state where the service level is 3 mu or higher. So we're reaching the states 3 or 4 within this CTMC. So generally, this will require a numerical solution of the CTMC. So, for example, in that case, if we want to make sure the time, we look at the time until we reach a state that satisfies that property of 3 mu or higher, we would make absorption at state 3 and solve for a transient solution. This only works when our models are relatively small. So we often use what instead is called statistical model checking, where again we're using a formula, but instead we use trajectories generated through the simulation and then look at the probability of the formula being satisfied by counting in some way which of the trajectories satisfy the property that I'm interested in. Okay, so this is a kind of schematic, and we're going to be looking at variations of this. So we have a CTMC, we execute it through stochastic simulation, creating sample trajectories. We apply the model checking, so we see for each trajectory, is the formula satisfied or not? And then we get a set of binary observations. And then from those observations, we use statistics, perhaps hypothesis testing. There are a variety of different ways that we do it to then say whether we feel the probabilistic formula is satisfied or not. So there are various problems that we encounter with this style of modelling. It gives us good explainability and a real descriptive understanding of the systems that we're trying to study, but like all discrete event approaches, we suffer from state space explosion or the curse of dimensionality. So this makes it quite costly computationally to analyse our models. What's more, quite often we don't know all those parameters. So in our CTMC, we need explicit rates for all the transitions, and we don't necessarily know what they are. So quite often we're looking at parameterized models. So here we see that the arrival rate will depend on some parameter x, and similarly the service rate might depend on x. X could be all sorts of things. It could be the congestion in the system, it could be the time of the day, it could be the temperature in a biological system, or even the pH. But these will change those rates in ways that we can't always predict in advance. So if we have such a system, what this model really represents is a whole distribution of CTMCs rather than a single one. So if we fix the parameter x, so we say that this is the model for, say, 10 o'clock in the morning, then we've got a concrete CTMC. So obviously, in recent years, machine learning has become extremely popular, and much more data-centric approach is taken, where we look at systems in terms of the input-output relation, usually based on many examples, and then we try and impute what is the relationship between input and output. In our formal models, what we do instead is we really look at the mechanisms within the system, and we explicitly build a representation of that function based on our state space representations. As I say, this has the advantage of greater explainability. It also allows us more freedom of extrapolating to how certain changes within the system might change the output that we observe. But it's natural that we have started looking at how these two different approaches can be combined together. And this is just a snapshot of some of the work that's been going on, particularly in the formal methods community, of looking at ways of making use of learning algorithms to either enhance our models or to combine a learned approach with a more mechanistic approach. I'm not going to talk about most of these. I will come back to this last one at the bottom, the smooth model checking, which is looking at that model checking approach, statistical model checking, but trying to take advantage of learning within that. So I'm going to give you two examples that we've looked at of this combination of the formal models with a more machine learning approach. And the first is using the statistical abstraction, so using machine learning actually applied to our models to produce a more compact model that's more efficient to run. And then the second is looking at that statistical model checking problem when we've got parameterized models of how can we actually improve how efficiently we do the sampling to get the best knowledge we can about how the system responds with respect to a particular formula. So, as I say, here what we're trying to do is actually look at inference to reduce the complexity of a formal model that we've built in order to make it more efficient to solve. So instead of collecting data perhaps from a real system, what we do is we do some initial explorations of the model, very short runs, and then use that to abstract and make our model simpler. So in particular, what we're looking at is a problem of multi-scale modelling, where we have different levels of behaviour, if you like. So there is a behaviour at a macro level, which depends on the micro level, and vice versa. So we've got basically the interaction between two models, which gets quite costly to run even in simulation. Sorry, I keep forgetting how to advance. So particularly what we're specifically looking at is sort of agents working in some spatial environment. So that you can think of the agents as being drones, bacteria, people moving in a city centre. The environment might be the temperature, chemical concentration, altitude, and the agents will move in and affect the environment, and the environment affects the agent. So we've got a kind of two-way feedback. So we've got our models of the agents themselves, how they're deciding to respond to the environment, but then by their response, they're altering the environment as well. And so we've got this multi-scale aspect to our model. So the general idea behind our abstraction is that we have this complex system with multiple layers, and each layer is modelled by a stochastic process. So in this case, they're not necessarily CTMCs, but they are a stochastic process, and we have an input process which generates, so we have input data which will generate outputs. And the outputs from one layer is the input to another. In this case, we're just going to consider two layers of the agents and the environment. So they kind of feed off each other, looking at the execution of the process at each layer. Some layers will be more costly to simulate than others, and in those cases what we seek to do is to replace with a stochastic map. So we replace our whole explanation of the mechanistic process with just a learned map from the input to an approximate output. Obviously, we want the approximate output to be as close as possible to the original output, but this much cheaper model will preserve the behaviour that we're interested in, but not be so time-consuming or just computationally consuming to execute. So the example I'm going to show you is motility of a bacterium, E. coli, and it has two modes of behaviour. So this is what we see in nature when you look at E. coli working on some substrate. So for example on an agar gel, it has two modes. So it has what's called run and tumble. When it runs, it moves, and you can see the patches on this trajectory where it's running, and then when it tumbles, it's searching for a new direction. So it stays more or less on the spot and reorientate itself to what it considers to be the most advantageous direction to move in next. For the bacteria, what they're trying to do is they're seeking food. So this is what's called chemotaxis. They will respond to the chemical environment they find themselves in and move in the direction towards a higher concentration of the chemical that's beneficial to them. So you can think of this as a biased random walk towards high concentrations. Because to actually fully understand this, we need to model both the movement, so this is kind of the environment of where the E. coli is placing itself, and then the internal structures of the E. coli of how it determines whether it's going to run and tumble and which direction it's going to go in. So this is a previously published model known to be pretty accurate and a good way of representing this behaviour, but it is extremely expensive to run. And so we're looking for a simpler, cheaper model that still captures chemotaxis. So to understand this decision between run and tumble, we have to understand a little bit about how E. coli works. So this is a cell with a number of flagella, which you can think of as hairs that stick outside the cell. And each flagella is rooted in a protein that's on the cell membrane, which is called the motor. And the flagella motor pair is in one of three conformations, and these are called semi-coiled, curly, and normal. That's just the way the biologists have named them. And the motor rotates either clockwise or counterclockwise. So that protein that's holding onto the hair may create a rotation in one of these directions. And within a single cell, we will have a number of these flagella, so each one of which is in this state semi-coiled, coiled, curly, or normal. And so we can think of the state of the cell as the count of the number of flagella that's semi-coiled, curly, or normal. So these X just represent counts. And so we have many different states because we have Z of these pairs, and each one can interact with the others. And this is the pattern of the phases that we see, that from the normal state the flagella can go to the semi-coiled, and then from semi-coiled it can go back to normal, or it can go on to curly, and then curly can go back on to normal. Okay, so this gives us the internal behaviour of each flagella motor pair, and then there are many of these within a cell, so within a single bacterium. So this is diagrammatically just showing that. So here is an example of one of our flagella motor pairs. So the motor is this protein here, and this is in these different states. So we could see a small state space, if you like this, for each of these blocks round the edge of the bacterium, around the cell. There are also what are called ligands on the surface of the cell, which sense the external environment. So they're looking for the concentration of the particular chemical that is beneficial for the bacterium. And then internally, we also have this process, if you like, or value that we call M, which is actually sort of history within the cell. So it remembers what concentration it saw previously. So if it moves, it knows what it's come from. So it can kind of develop this idea of moving towards higher concentrations. So our environment is represented to us by these parameters L and M, and our internal state or process is represented by the array of many different flagellar motor pairs in these different states N, C, and S. Okay, and to determine whether a cell will run at the next or conversely tumble, we say it runs if there are no flagellar motor pairs that are currently in the semicoiled state, and the number that are in the normal state is 2 or greater. Okay, so that we can actually get the counterclockwise rotation that we need, all the flagella start moving together and the bacterium moves. If they're not in sync like that, then we get a tumbling to recreate the orientation. So our transition rates, so we've got K here for the movement between normal and semi-coiled and from curly to normal. And then we have this parameter mu, which is known between semi-coiled and curly. So the one that we're really interested in is this parameter K, and this is influenced by what's observed from outside. So they're changing their transition rates K depending on these external parameters M and L. Okay, so we assume there is some function we don't know that is dependent on M and L, and this will give us the value of the K's here for moving between these different states. The function G is estimated in this paper by Snedden, Pontius and Emanet, which was published in 2012, and shows, as I say, this is the model that gives very good faithful representation of how E. coli behave within chemical fields. Okay. But this model is very expensive to run. So the state changes inside the model we represent in chemical reaction form. So we say that we have some chemical reaction form just says we have some number of particles of some type, which we call a species, and through a reaction we then get a number of particles of a different type. So the things. So in terms of our state space here, we say that we have if we have a motor flagella pair in state S with rate mu, we generate a floater-Magella pair in state C. So that's just a way of representing this as our chemical reactions. As I say, these are just different formalisms that we can use to help us reason about these systems. So this would be an individual, the possible behaviours of an individual flagella motor pair, but there's a whole population of these at work within a cell. So to simulate a trajectory, what we do is we sense the current concentration in our current location. This is the outer layer. We estimate M given how long has elapsed since last time we did this and our current value of L. Then we simulate the population Markov chain for the next time step and we get a final state. This will then evaluate as we run or we tumble, and we then go back to the outer layer, carrying out that run or tumble, and then start again to sense the ligand concentration at that time and go on. So this is how we simulate the trajectories. And when we do this just with the naive model, then we get a trajectory like this. So we're starting somewhere here and higher concentration is down here towards the yellow, and you can see it's a random walk. This is a single trajectory. It's not entirely successful, but it's sort of drifting in the right direction. If we look at a number of different instantiations of this, we will see that on average we're moving towards the higher concentration over time. So this is 500 time steps, and this is the standard deviations within our sample. So what do we want to do? We want to reduce that whole population CTMC of looking at all the different in flagellar motor pairs to just a decision variable essentially for this cell of do I run or do I tumble. We have that history step, so we have a DTMC here that's saying 1, I think here is run, and we look at the previous step as well, and 2 is tumble, and we want to estimate the structure of this DTMC. So instead of doing this whole simulation and observing the final state, we just want to simulate this very much simpler DTMC and just make the choice, are we running or tumbling in this case? So we need to estimate these probabilities of moving between the states. So we don't have those K that we had before that were directly based on L and M. We have instead these probabilities. And we need to then get those, as I say, as a Bernoulli trial essentially on the values of M and H at a particular time step. So the micro-trajectories give us observations for these Bernoulli outcomes. So we do run that population CTMC, but just for very short time span, so that we can build an estimate of these probability distributions. We assume that P and L are smooth functions, and we use the estimates that we get from these very short simulation runs to then build our probability distribution here. And we use Gaussian process classification for that. So when we do this, we, as I say, take very short runs, starting at a sample of places within our parameter space. So this is looking at different levels of the methylation, which is our historic process, and the ligand concentration, which is our external monitoring. And then we get these sample points. These are the little red points that you see here, are all our training points. And then we use the Gaussian process classification to impute the function of this surface. And so that gives us where we make the decision to run and where we make the decision to tumble. So these are actually just the converse of each other from this. So now we can just use that model instead of the fuller model, and we estimate the new value of M given our value of L and the time step. We sample using our Bernoulli trial to say, are we run or tumbling? We update our external model accordingly, and then we run this again. So it's this inner loop has been greatly simplified to be this much more abstract version. So if we look at a single trajectory again, so here we're starting at the red spot and we're moving down, and you can see again it's driven by the chemotaxis, and we get a similar process when we look at a population, that we are definitely moving towards the higher concentration over time with a certain amount of variation that happens through the individual runs. So what we've done is previously we were using this population continuous time Markov chain, and we've moved to the DTMC encoded as this Bernoulli trial. But the outer loop is staying just the same. So this was our training environment. We did those short simulation runs, just looking at a field of concentrations that's just governed by a Gaussian field, which we call L1, and so it's completely static. And this is where we did our sample runs and then built the Bernoulli trials based on that. And then we actually embedded this reduced model into into different environments. So this one is non-isotropic. So the concentration of the the attractive chemical is not following a Gaussian distribution. It's a sort of bespoke system. But again, you can see the original and the abstracted stay quite close together. And then finally, we actually looked at where you're dropping more of the concentration into the field as the simulation is running. So the concentration is itself dynamic as we alter the concentration. And again, we get very good agreement between the original and the abstract. That's just examining it visually, but we can also look at a Kolmos-Smirnov test, and you can see here that we're getting, as the time progresses, we're getting a good agreement in the patterns here between the original and the abstracted version. And we can look at the p-values here. We're seeing that as time goes on, we're getting a good estimate for each of the different cases, the original Gaussian, the linear, and the dynamic field. And what's also interesting here is if we look at the speed up, so how long does it take to run these simulations compared with if we did the full simulation, and it's approximately a factor of 9 across the different types. This one is actually not quite so good because this is the one where we're including within that the small simulation runs that we do to train our Bernoulli sampler. So in summary of this, it's much faster to simulate. The important components and behaviours are preserved. There is a small accuracy loss because of the way we do our Gaussian process classification. But if the model is nonlinear, for our case, it wasn't too bad. If you had a much more complicated macro-scale behaviour, you may see more deterioration than we have. We see this consistency. We can put it into a completely different environment from where we actually trained the approximation with the simulation runs, and as long as it's still within the range of inputs that we looked at, we still get very good consistency. And there is that small upfront cost of running the simulations to generate the training points, which was in our case 15 minutes, compared with running the whole thing with the full complement population CTMC, which was 450 minutes. So really a very long running simulation. To do this, we can reduce substantially. So that appeared in the journal Tomax probably about 5 years ago. Then the second one I want to just quickly touch on is looking at that problem of statistical model checking for the models, for the parametric CTMCs, where we don't know all the parameter values. So in particular, we don't know all the rates. So here our rates are functions of some unknown parameter x, and each value of particular of x will give us a CTMC. So if we evaluate x explicitly, we get a single CTMC. If we look at it over a set, we can have a set. But generally what we're doing is we're saying that x has some distribution, and so what we're looking at is a distribution of CTMCs. And if we look at the model checking problem, so remember here what we've got is a logical formula that we are evaluating against single trajectories to know what's the probability that the CTMC satisfies the formula. Once we're into a parameterized CTMC, what we're looking at is a surface for that parameter, and what's the probability of satisfying the formula over that surface. So we get a distribution over the surface. So for the individual, if we pick a particular parameter x, we run a stochastic simulation, we generate sample trajectories, we carry out some model checking, and then we get those binary observations. If we're looking at it in the parametric case, then the naive approach would be that we just generate lots of the vectors of the different values that x can take. We get a set of observations for each one of those values, and then we estimate the satisfaction probability at each point. And then the naive way of doing that would be that for a particular value xi, we generate a whole set of yi, and then we just use a frequentist approach. So we say that we want to count the proportion of times that our formula is satisfied over all the samples that we got. So that would be just sampling for each one, and then through the generating the samples, we start to get a probability distribution over that. We get a satisfaction probability over the distribution of values of X. So to give you a small concrete example, we'll look at an SIR model, so susceptible, infected, recovered, again represented as a chemical reaction network. So here we're saying that a susceptible that gets exposed to an infected generates an infected and an infected, but an infected that can undergo some process can become recovered. Okay, so that's just our simple system, and these are our unknown parameters in the system, Ki for the rate of infection and Kr for the rate of recovery. So supposing that this is our unknown variable X, our parameter X, then we want to look at the probability of satisfying our formula, which is here expressed. It's written like this in the particular logic that I'm using, metric interval temporal logic, but just in words, what it's saying is eventually, if I look at the period from time 100 to 120, there will be no infected agents. And if I look globally, so at all points in time between 0 and 100, there is at least one infected agent. Okay, so the infection's not drying out until after time 100, but after time 100 and before time 120, the infection will have died out. And we want to look at this for all different values of Ki and Kr, so looking at the probability, because this may tell us some probability value that's important to us. We want to maintain this property. We say, well, it must be the case that we stamp out infections with a rate greater than this value, or it may be that depending on what our rate values are, that can tell us what course of action to take. So if we do the naive approach and just do lots and lots of samples, we can generate a surface like this. So these are our two unknown variables, Ki and Kr, and we can see that the probability is 0 for much of the space here where it's black, and then we've got this value around Kr equals 0.1, where we have some higher probability of actually satisfying the formula that we want. The shortcomings of the naive approach is that it's not very good at modelling the dependency between the satisfaction and the parameterization, and potentially we need a very large number of simulation trajectories at each point to try and build that surface to be accurate. So we take inspiration from an earlier piece of work which was called smooth model checking, in which the rates are assumed to change continuously, and that we can generate a data set of points. So we have our parameterization xi and yi, and we use that to train a Gaussian process classification model based on the data set that we've got. So we make a set of observations, and then we get a classification model. So if we were doing Gaussian process regression, we might start with a Gaussian prior, so just something like this. We've got a whole lot of functions in our sample space. We make some observations, and then we can reduce the posterior distribution significantly by our observations. And in the case of the regression, finding this posterior distribution is relatively straightforward because it's analytically computable. But in terms of classification, we don't have that opportunity. It's no longer directly computable. What we're trying to do is classify, instead of over the range minus infinity to infinity, to probabilities that are in the range 0 to 1. And we use a logistic function to then look at our likelihood of a particular observation from our function in terms of a Bernoulli. And unlike the case, as I said, this is no longer analytically tractable, so we need to make approximations. So we approximate this P with a function Q, which is a multivariate normal distribution. So the smooth model checking approach, which, as I say, came from the work of Bortolucci and others, assumes that there are standard methods for inference of Gaussian process classification, but unfortunately these do not scale well as you observe more and more data points, which is something that we generally need to do. And there is a lot of computational effort potentially in areas of the parameter space where the satisfaction probability function is not changing very much. So we saw in that naive sample that we did that there were large areas that were black. So nothing was, the formula was just never going to be satisfied there. And there wasn't a lot more information from sampling within that region. So we address these by looking at using sparse variational approximations and by using to address this problem of scalability with number of points and by using active learning in terms of choosing where to put those points. So in terms of sparse Gaussian approximation, what we do is we use an approach that was developed by Buie and others in the NIPS paper in 2017, which was called Sparse Gaussian Process Approximation, based on streaming. So you're generating data as you go along, and if you can see them here, there are little black crosses, and then we use those as inducing points instead of using exhaustive search of the whole space. And so that's our first approach, is to look at that more sparse approach. And then active learning is instead what we do is we look at what information have we gained by our current set of samples, and then we use that to guide where we take our next samples. So we generate observations as before, we get that set of observation data. We're using the streamed Gaussian process inference to give us that smooth view and the classification process to then guide us through that with active learning. So we construct our query strategy towards the high interest areas. So where are we going to get more information about that surface rather than just uniformly using induction points over the whole surface? So there's two different ways that we can do it. We can do it in terms of predictive variance. So in other words, where the model is most uncertain, and this is what's done in the smooth model checking. You concentrate your next samples to where that distribution is still wide. And then the other way is to look at it where the predictive mean is steepest, so where the things seem to be changing most. And we implemented both of these in our active learning framework. So if we just look at using the streaming, we take these points on the induction points, and then we impute the rest of the surface from those points. Okay, and this gives us a result like this. If we instead use the active learning, instead of sampling uniformly across the whole space, we look at the places where we gained sort of most information. And so we would start with the blue iteration, and then for the next we would move on to these orange ones where we're getting more information. You see that's clustered in this area where there seems to be highest predictive variance, so that's where the slope is there. If instead we look at the steepest gradient, again we start with these induction points, but then at the next points we get these orange ones where we're seeing the highest change in the values that we impute. So if we take the same number of samples from a full Gaussian process, we get a much coarser approximation of this surface. So this is using the same number of samples as we had with the previous ones. So if I just go back, and you can see that these are much more defined for the same number of samples. If we look at that in terms of the error that we're getting within our system, you can see that the sparse smooth model checking, improves things a bit, but not a great deal. But when we move down to the active learning approach, we're able to reduce the error considerably. And both the techniques of predictive variance or steepest mean show a greater improvement for the same sampling cost. So using the active learning allows us to concentrate on where we're going to get the most information. This greatly can speed up our statistical model checking and answer questions about these parameterized models. I'm really conscious of time, so I'm going to speed through the next bit, but it is really just more provocation because there's things. So thinking about LLMs from the point of view of performance modeling, and we think about resources, LLMs have not been subject to performance modelling in the sense that I mean as a performance modeler of thinking about resource use. So however we look at LLMs, they are using a huge amount of resource. Maybe not infinite, but large enough that it's shown that there is no resource constraint. So this is looking at the number of parameters. This is the number of words, if we're looking at the text that's used to train these models. And this is the cost, which is often used as the proxy for the amount of computational power that's used. So I was very curious to look at why people aren't worried about performance. They started to be worried about sustainability and energy consumption, but that's a slightly different consideration from performance thinking from the resource point of view. If you look in the LLM literature, there is a lot of work about performance, but it's not from the point of view of resources. Resources are never really mentioned. It's all done from user-defined measures in terms of things like accuracy, precision. And progress in the field has been driven by league tables, etc., seeking to optimize accuracy and precision, so these user measures, without considering the actual resource that's needed to calculate them. And so as an effect, this is why it's become the predominance of the big tech companies, because they're the only ones who can afford to put in ever more resource and keep driving advances in this user-centric view of performance. And there are, as I said, current issues towards reducing carbon footprints, but this is largely handcrafted and ad hoc. But it's not trivial to do this, to shift over into trying to do performance modelling as I would interpret performance modelling on these LLMs. The metrics are not clear, particularly when we're looking at training, because these are not interactive systems. We're not thinking in terms of response time or throughput. Utilization is not really a useful measure, because in these systems when they're training, the GPUs are typically at full utilization and there is no idle time. What's more, the size of the LLMs and in terms of what's happening there, the processing, far exceed our capabilities with existing modelling techniques. So what we're trying to do is combine some of these data-driven models with the formal models to put some light on LLMs. So that's the conclusion of my talk. I hope I've given you an introduction to perhaps an area you've not seen before of quantified formal methods, and in particular shown you how we've been working to combine that with machine learning rather than having machine learning just replace these models, to improve the efficiency of our models and to increase the size of systems that we can look at. We looked at two techniques, statistical abstraction and sampling, and embedding the learning within the modelling framework allowed us to really advance the type of systems that we can look at. So it remains just to thank my co-authors on the first piece of work on the multi-level abstraction, multi-scale abstraction. My co-authors were Michalis Michailidis and Guido Sanguinetti, and the active learning was with Paul Piho, who was my PhD student, and these were funded by AppCirc and ERC. So thank you very much for listening.